The galaxy had seen its share of wars, conflicts that stretched across vast distances, battles that obliterated entire worlds, and power struggles that seemed to never end. Species as diverse as the stars themselves had clashed in bloody contests for dominance, resources, and survival. The Saurians, with their towering strength and unyielding resolve, had long been warriors. The Vreks, a race of highly intelligent beings, had a knack for strategy that made them nearly unstoppable on the battlefield. The Irians, masters of energy manipulation, wielded powers that others could only dream of. Yet none of them had faced an enemy like the Zhak. The Zizak were not just a threat. They were an ancient, unstoppable force that could erase entire civilizations from existence. Their empire had once stretched across the galaxy, their reign unchallenged for millennia. Their ships were capable of wiping out entire fleets in moments, their soldiers ruthless and efficient. Then, after a cataclysmic war, the Zizak were believed to be extinct, their empire shattered, and their remnants scattered across forgotten corners of space. The galaxy had breathed a collective sigh of relief. For centuries, peace reigned. But peace, it seemed, was a fragile thing. One fateful day, deep in the heart of the galaxy, a strange signal began to pulse through the interstellar network. At first, it was nothing more than a faint whisper, an anomaly in the communication channels that was dismissed as a glitch, a misfire, or an unimportant fragment of interference. The signal was unlike anything the galaxy's best minds had ever encountered. It was brief, encoded in a language that was foreign to all known species, yet it carried a weight of desperation. As the signal grew stronger and more insistent, something strange happened. The Zizak were back. The realization struck like a thunderclap. The galaxy once again was on the brink of annihilation. The ancient enemy, long thought defeated, had returned, and this time there was no sign of weakness. The first worlds to fall were utterly unprepared. The Zizak descended on them with the brutal efficiency of a force from beyond time, their massive warships tearing through planetary defenses like paper. Entire populations were wiped out, their cities reduced to rubble in hours. The remaining species, united in fear, scrambled to form alliances and bring their armies to bear. But it was clear that none of them were ready for the Zizak. Desperate, the galaxy's council called for help. They needed heroes, champions who could face this unimaginable threat head-on. Leaders of ancient races, once proud and powerful, had no answers. Their fleets were no match for the Zizak's overwhelming might. Ancient wisdom, technology, and history offered no guidance, no hope. The people of the galaxy, long accustomed to peace, found themselves trembling in the face of a terror that was older than the stars themselves. In that moment of crisis, a small, relatively unknown species received a strange message, a flicker in their primitive communication channels that no one had expected. It was a simple message, filled with confusion and disbelief. Earth, a planet on the edge of the galaxy, with little more than rudimentary space travel and barely any understanding of the universe beyond their own solar system. They were not a species of warriors, not a people of legends. They were, in the grand scheme of the cosmos, inconsequential. Yet, for reasons that no one could explain, it was Earth that responded. A small group of human engineers working on a long-forgotten communications project stumbled upon the distress signal. They had no idea what it meant, no understanding of the galaxy's current plight, but they knew it was important. Against all odds, they decoded the message, and in doing so, unknowingly triggered the first real hope the galaxy had seen in centuries. The humans had answered the call. What followed would defy all expectations. It was not the galaxy's greatest minds, nor its fiercest warriors who rose to meet the Zizak. It was the humans, with their ingenuity, their resilience, and their unrelenting spirit. They had no vast fleets, no ancient technologies, and no legendary warriors. What they had was an unshakable determination to fight for their survival. And in the darkest hour, that was enough to make all the difference. It began as a simple anomaly, a strange flicker in the galaxy's communication network. To most, it was just an odd distortion, a brief moment of interference that went unnoticed among the countless signals flooding the system. But for a small team of engineers working in a dusty, underfunded corner of Earth's communication division, it was the spark that would change everything. Captain Elizabeth Hawke, a former combat pilot turned project manager, stood in front of a bank of monitors, her eyes fixed on the strange signal that had begun pulsing through the outdated equipment. The faint hum of the system's machinery filled the background as she leaned forward, adjusting the filters. She had been part of the communications division for years, but this was unlike anything she had ever seen. The distortion wasn't random. There was a pattern to it. The frequency was foreign, too complex, too intricate to be the result of a malfunction. "Send the signal to Dr. Carter," she ordered, her voice steady but laced with curiosity. Dr. Ethan Carter, an eccentric scientist with a reputation for solving the unsolvable, was the first person who came to her mind. If anyone could make sense of this, it was him. Minutes later, Dr. Carter appeared on the screen, his glasses perched precariously on his nose. He blinked at the signal and muttered to himself, tapping the side of his head as if in deep thought. "What do we have here?" he asked, looking at Hawke with a raised eyebrow. "I think it's something important," she replied. "I've never seen a transmission like this before. It's not just noise, there's data embedded in it. We need to figure out what it's saying." They spent the next several hours analyzing the signal, running it through every piece of technology at their disposal. There was no real explanation for how it had come through Earth's systems or why. The signal seemed almost to have been designed specifically to bypass normal communication channels. It was as if something, had wanted to make contact with humanity, and in some strange twist of fate, they had. Dr. Carter finally paused, staring at the decoding software with wide eyes. "It's a distress call," he said, almost in disbelief. "From somewhere far beyond our system. From another galaxy, even." "Who would send us a distress signal?" Hawke asked, her mind racing. Earth wasn't a beacon of power or influence in the cosmos. They were barely out of their own solar system, and their technology was still in its infancy compared to the galactic civilizations that existed beyond their reach. The signal was clear enough now, though. In simple terms, it called for help, desperate help. But it wasn't just any call. It was an urgent plea from a race of beings who had encountered an unimaginable enemy, an enemy so vast and dangerous that it threatened to consume everything in its path. The Zejak, as the signal identified them, were a species of unmatched power, a force that had once dominated the galaxy. They had disappeared for millennia, but now they were returning, and their mission was clear: annihilate all in their way. It didn't take long for Hawke and Carter to realize the gravity of what they had uncovered. The signal wasn't just a cry for help, it was a warning. The Zejak were coming, and they were coming for everyone. Earth was far from ready to face such an enemy, but there was no denying that their involvement was now inevitable. The message had reached them for a reason. Whether they were ready or not, humanity had been called upon. With grim determination, Hawke turned to Dr. Carter. "We need to contact the higher-ups. This is beyond us now." But even as they began preparing to send their findings to Earth's leadership, neither of them could have anticipated what would follow. The Galactic Council, upon receiving word of Earth's newfound knowledge, would soon demand more than just information. They would demand action. And in that moment, humanity would find itself at the precipice of something much greater than they had ever imagined. As they boarded the newly arriving submarine, the question was no longer if they would rise to the challenge. It was how. How could a species so young, so small, possibly stand against the unimaginable threat of the Zejak? The answer was unknown, but humanity had always been good at finding answers when the stakes were high, and this time the stakes were nothing less than the survival of the galaxy itself. The galaxy's response to the humans' involvement in the war against the Zajak was nothing short of disbelief. How could a species so young, so inexperienced, be of any use against such a formidable enemy? The Council of the Great Races debated fiercely in the days following Earth's discovery of the Zajak threat. The Saurians, with their massive war fleets, were skeptical. The Irians, who had mastered energy-based warfare, were dismissive of humans, who still relied on crude projectile weapons. Even the Vreks, whose intelligence was unparalleled, questioned the value of such an untested species in the face of a force like the Zajak. But the humans, despite their relative youth and lack of advanced technology, were not deterred. A message from Captain Hawk to the Galactic Council outlined their resolve, as well as their understanding of the Zajak's tactics, drawn from the cryptic signal they had decoded. The Zajak, they knew, were relentless, destructive, and adaptable, but they were also predictable. They had weaknesses, and the humans had already begun to identify them. What Earth lacked in raw power, they made up for with an unyielding determination to survive. And so, the humans were given a chance, albeit a begrudging one. Captain Hawk was appointed as the commander of a small but strategic force to join the Galactic Coalition. She wasn't a galactic hero or a legendary warrior. She was a product of Earth's military, just another officer. But that was all the galaxy had. The Urians had sent their best diplomats, the Saurians had sent their most experienced generals, but the humans were a wild card. No one knew what to expect. When Captain Hawk boarded the human flagship, the Liberty's Hope, she was joined by Dr. Carter, who had become an unlikely expert on Zajak technology. The crew aboard the ship was equally unremarkable by galactic standards, mostly human engineers and soldiers, many of them still learning how to operate advanced alien tech they had barely begun to understand. Yet, they were the only ones ready to act. They had no choice. The Liberty's Hope was equipped with the most advanced weapons Earth had at the time, laser cannons and rudimentary shields, but they were far from the cutting-edge designs the galactic races had at their disposal. Yet there was a certain magic in the air. There was an energy among the crew that couldn't be quantified by technology alone. It wasn't skill, and it certainly wasn't experience. It was something deeper, a drive to prove that they could contribute to something much bigger than themselves. Dr. Carter often found himself musing over the paradox of it all. They were fighting a species that had wiped out entire civilizations, and yet they were confident in their own ability to make a difference. It was almost laughable, if it weren't so tragic. Earth's place in the grand scheme of things had always been small, but here, in this moment, Earth was everything. They were the last hope for the galaxy, a species who had no business in this fight, but who had a burning desire to win it anyway. As the fleet prepared to depart, Hawk stood at the command center, looking out at the stars. She had never imagined she would be in this position. The weight of responsibility pressed on her, but there was no time to dwell on it. They were ready. She had no illusions about their chances, but she had something no one else could take from her: resolve. The Liberty's Hope and its small crew were about to head into the unknown, into a war unlike anything humanity had ever faced. They didn't have the luxury of being cautious or strategic. They had to act now, and they had to act fast. The Zajak were coming, and they would need every scrap of courage, every ounce of ingenuity, and every bit of strength they could muster. The humans were not the strongest species in the galaxy, but perhaps they were the ones who understood best that even the smallest spark of hope could light up the darkest of nights. It was that spark that would guide them in the battles to come. The battles with the Zajak were unlike anything the humans had ever encountered. The alien forces were not just powerful, they were terrifying in their efficiency, their overwhelming numbers, and their cold, relentless will to destroy. Yet, in every skirmish, the humans found something that the Zajak could not anticipate: the ability to adapt, to think outside the boundaries of conventional warfare. Their strategies were not born from centuries of tradition or ancient wisdom, but from the raw ingenuity that humans had developed over generations. Captain Hawk, now a leader with no room for doubt or hesitation, stood at the helm of the Liberty's Hope as the first major battle with the Zajac loomed. The galaxy's greatest minds had devised plans for the coming confrontation, but it was Hawk's team, along with the humans she had brought together, that would put those plans into motion. Their task was simple: hold the line. But holding the line against the Zajac was anything but simple. The Liberty's Hope was a modest ship by galactic standards, nothing like the massive dreadnoughts of the Saurians or the sleek warships of the Irians. But what it lacked in size and firepower, it made up for in unexpected creativity. Dr. Carter, with his deep understanding of the Zajac's technology, had worked tirelessly to find ways to turn their own strength against them. He had managed to hack into Zajac communications and intercept their battle strategies, a feat that had once seemed impossible. It wasn't just about brute force. It was about understanding how the Zajac thought, how they moved, and where their blind spots were. In one of the first confrontations, the humans used a tactic that no one had thought of before. The Zajac relied heavily on their overwhelming firepower and advanced weapons systems, but they had an Achilles heel. Their ships were designed for direct combat, not for evasion. The humans had no intention of matching their firepower. Instead, they used a series of feints and misdirections, forcing the Zajac ships to chase phantom targets. The tactic was simple, almost too simple, but it worked. The Zajac, accustomed to dominating the battlefield through force, were thrown off by the unpredictable movements of their human adversaries. The humans' ability to improvise became their greatest asset. They were quick to learn, quick to adapt. During a skirmish near the edge of a dying star, Captain Hawk and her crew had to contend with a Zajac ambush. Their first instinct might have been to flee, but instead, they turned the tables. They used the star's gravitational pull to slingshot their ship around it, creating a sudden burst of speed that took the Zajac by surprise. In the chaos, they managed to disable one of the Zajac ships, a major victory in a war that had only just begun. Back on the Liberty's Hope, morale began to rise. The humans were not winning battles in the traditional sense. They weren't crushing their enemies with superior firepower, but they were winning the war of attrition. Every small victory, every clever tactic, was another crack in the Zajac's seemingly impenetrable armor. The more they fought, the more they learned, and the more they began to realize something fundamental. The Zajac were not invincible. They could be beaten. But the real turning point came when the humans, in their relentless pursuit of a way to understand the Zajac, discovered something that no one else had noticed. The Zajac were not as unified as they appeared. There were fractures within their ranks, power struggles that had been buried beneath the surface of their empire. Some factions within the Zajac were more ruthless than others, but not all of them were in agreement on how to handle the conquest of the galaxy. This discovery led to new opportunities to sow discord among the Zajac, to create divisions and turn their strength into a vulnerability. With every skirmish, every engagement, the humans were learning. They were proving that their most powerful weapon was not their firepower or technology, but their capacity for innovation, their ability to think outside the box. They had no great traditions to draw from, no ancient wisdom to guide them, but what they had was something far more dangerous to an enemy like the Zajac: the will to survive, and the determination to do whatever it took to win. It wasn't just about fighting back. It was about redefining the rules of the fight entirely. And in doing so, they were rewriting the very meaning of heroism. The war had escalated in ways no one had anticipated. Despite their early victories, the humans were still a far cry from being a decisive force in the galactic struggle. The Zajac, relentless as ever, began to adapt to the human tactics, learning from their failures. Their fleets grew in size, and their strategies became more complex. It was clear that the humans, while resourceful, would need more than just clever tactics to keep up with an enemy that could outnumber them and outgun them at every turn. But Captain Hawk was not one to back down. She had seen the glimmers of hope in the dark, the small victories that had begun to pile up and turn the tide, even if just a little. She knew that this was no ordinary fight. It wasn't just about who had the biggest fleet or the most advanced weapons. The war against the Zizak had become a battle of wills, and Hawk had something the Zizak could never fully understand: humanity's unyielding refusal to give up. The next mission would be their most dangerous yet. A convoy of essential resources, meant to supply the resistance, was under attack by a fleet of Zizak destroyers. The convoy was crucial. Without it, the human forces would be left vulnerable, unable to continue their fight. The Zizak knew this, and they were determined to wipe out the convoy and choke off humanity's supply lines. The task force under Hawk's command was tasked with defending it, but they had no illusions. The odds were steep, and even if they succeeded, the risk of heavy casualties was high. They came upon the convoy in the dead of night, well, the galactic equivalent of it. The blackness of space swallowed them whole as they approached the target zone. Captain Hawk's nerves were steely, though she could sense the anxiety that rippled through the crew. They were facing a formidable foe, but Hawk had learned long ago that fear could either paralyze you or drive you forward. She chose to drive. Dr. Carter was beside her, eyes scanning the data streaming across his console. The Zizak ships were on the move, closing in fast. Hawk's mind raced as she ran through the battle plan. It was bold, reckless even, but sometimes that was the only option left when you were outmatched. Instead of confronting the Zizak head-on, they would split their forces and attack from unexpected angles. It wasn't a perfect strategy, but it played to humanity's strength, surprise and unpredictability. "Ready, Captain." Carter's voice broke through her thoughts. The nervous tension in his tone was evident, but there was something else too, a glimmer of hope. He too had begun to believe that the humans could pull off the impossible. "Then let's make it count," Hawk said, her voice steady. She gave the order to engage. The Liberty's Hope and its fleet of smaller human ships darted into the fray, executing a daring series of maneuvers that confused and scattered the Zizak forces. Hawk's crew had practiced this tactic dozens of times, but now, in the heat of battle, every move was vital. The first few exchanges were brutal. Zizak firepower tore through the space around them, and the human ships were forced to weave through laser fire and missile barrages. Yet, for every hit they took, they gave back 2, 3, 10-fold. The humans didn't fight like the other races. They fought like they had nothing to lose. In the chaos, one of the Zizak capital ships was momentarily isolated, separated from the main fleet. The humans seized the opportunity, throwing everything they had at the vulnerable ship. It was a gamble, an all-or-nothing move. The Liberty's Hope and a handful of human ships unleashed a barrage of missiles, laser blasts, and even experimental EMP charges that Dr. Carter had helped develop. The Zizak ship, taken off guard by the ferocity of the attack, went up in flames, its massive hull exploding in a spectacular burst of energy. But victory came at a cost. The humans had taken heavy casualties and many ships had been severely damaged. The convoy, however, had survived. As Hawk surveyed the damage from the command deck, she knew they had won this battle. But at what price? There was no time for celebration. They had bought themselves only a little more time, but time was something they didn't have in abundance. The Zizak would retaliate, and they would be back with even greater force. Yet, as Captain Hawk stood in the aftermath of the battle, something shifted in her. The humans were not a fluke. They were no longer just a desperate species clinging to survival. They had found their strength in the darkest of places. They had begun to show the galaxy what they were made of. And though the war was far from over, the Zizak would learn something they hadn't counted on. Humanity would never stop fighting. The battle had been brutal, but it was a turning point. The humans were no longer the underdogs. They were a force to be reckoned with, and the Zizak had just made their first mistake. They had underestimated humanity's will to survive. The war against the Zizak was far from over, but the tide had shifted. What had begun as a desperate struggle for survival had transformed into something more. The humans, once viewed as insignificant by the galactic powers, were now seen as the key to turning the war. They had managed to achieve what many had thought impossible, surviving against the Zejak, and in some cases, even defeating them. The Liberty's hope drifted through the void of space, its battered hull a testament to the battles it had endured. Captain Hawk stood on the bridge, staring out into the infinite blackness. The stars were bright and cold, a reminder that there was no end to the war in sight. But the humans had proven themselves in ways that no one had expected. The question now wasn't whether they could survive, it was how far they could push the Zok back. The human fleet had expanded, bolstered by the support of other races who had begun to see the value of their tactics and adaptability. The Saurians, after seeing the success of the human guerrilla tactics, had offered their own ships to reinforce the human fleet. The Aryans, once skeptical, had begun sharing their advanced energy weapons with Earth's force. Even the Vreks, who were focused primarily on intellect and strategy, had acknowledged that humanity's unorthodox approach to warfare might just be the key to defeating the Zejak. But with each victory came a greater challenge. The Zejak had not been idle. Their retreat after the loss of their capital ship had been temporary. Now, they had gathered their remaining strength for a final push. A massive fleet, larger and more powerful than anything the humans had yet faced. The Zejak had learned from their previous failures and were prepared to eliminate the human threat, once and for all. Captain Hawk knew the time had come for humanity to do what it did best: fight back with everything they had. The humans had no grand fleets or advanced superweapons like the other races, but they had something more dangerous: an ability to improvise, to think on their feet. It was this unpredictability that made the Zejak so uneasy. Dr. Carter had been tirelessly studying the Zejak's battle strategies, looking for weaknesses. The Zejak were brutal and efficient, but they had a blind spot: their overconfidence. They expected their size and strength to dominate every encounter. What they didn't anticipate was the human penchant for deception. Hawk's fleet had been outfitted with experimental cloaking devices. Imperfect, but effective enough to allow them to sneak past the Zeyok's sensors and strike when the enemy least expected it. The plan was audacious, risky, and dangerous. They would infiltrate the heart of the Zeyok's fleet and plant a series of bombs designed to cripple their command ships. The bombs were small, but if placed correctly, they could disable the Zeyok's control over their forces, throwing them into disarray. It was a long shot, but it was humanity's best chance. Hawk gathered her officers in the war room, the air thick with tension. Each person in the room had volunteered for this mission, fully aware of the risks. There was no guarantee that they would succeed, but failure meant the end for humanity. This was the moment when everything would either change or end. "We have one shot at this," Hawk said, her voice unwavering. "If we fail, the Zak will tear us apart. But if we succeed, we disrupt their entire fleet. We'll create a hole in their defenses that will allow us to strike from all sides." She looked around the room at her team. Each of them had come from different walks of life, but now they were united by a single purpose: survival. The room was quiet as the officers nodded, the gravity of the situation settling over them. "Let's make it count," Hawk said, her words sharp and final. The mission would take them deep into the heart of enemy territory, a place where even the bravest would hesitate to venture. As they prepared to launch, Hawk found herself reflecting on how far they had come. The humans who had once been seen as weak, insignificant, had become the unexpected heroes of the galaxy. They were fighting not just for their survival, but for the survival of countless species who had no idea how to resist the Zahak. The humans had proven something crucial to the galaxy. They had proven that no matter how dark the situation, no matter how overwhelming the odds, the strength to fight back always came from within. They had found courage in the face of certain death, and it was this courage, this refusal to give up, that would be their greatest weapon against the Jacques. As the fleet made its final approach toward the Zajac flagship, Hawk took one last look at her crew. They were ready. Humanity was ready. And for the first time in the war, she believed it was possible to defeat the Zajac and finally give the galaxy the chance it so desperately needed. The final battle was upon them. The fleet, now a mixture of human ships and the reinforcements from the Saurians, Irians, and other galactic allies, approached the heart of the Zajac armada. Captain Hawk stood on the bridge of the Liberty's Hope, her hands resting firmly on the console, her gaze fixed ahead. The stars outside were distant pinpricks of light, cold and indifferent. Inside her ship, the crew was tense but resolute. Each person knew that this was the moment that would decide not only the fate of humanity, but the fate of the galaxy itself. The Zajac flagship, a colossal vessel of dark, jagged metal, loomed on the edge of the battlefield. It was a symbol of the enemy's power, a terrifying force that had crushed entire civilizations without mercy. But now, as the humans and their allies advanced, there was something different in the air. The Zajac had underestimated them before, and now they would pay the price. Hawk's mind raced as she reviewed the mission once more. They had to strike quickly, plant the bombs inside the flagship's command center, disrupt its power core, and cripple the entire fleet before the Zajac could react. It was a task that seemed insurmountable, yet they had no choice. There was no retreat, no backup plan. The human fleet had already committed. They were all in. "Status report, Dr. Carter?" Hawk asked, her voice steady but carrying an underlying tension. "We're in position, Captain," Carter replied, his voice calm, though there was an edge to it. "The cloaking devices are holding. The Zac haven't detected us yet. We're ready to execute as planned." Hawk nodded, eyes narrowing in concentration. "Then it's time to move." The ship split off into smaller formations, each one tasked with a specific role in the attack. The humans' unpredictability was their greatest weapon. No one knew what to expect from them, and the Zajac had learned that the hard way. Using the cover of darkness and the element of surprise, they maneuvered into the heart of the Zajac fleet, weaving through the massive warships like shadows in the void. The Liberty's Hope itself had a direct course toward the Zajac flagship. The bomb-laden ships behind it would create a diversion, drawing the Zajac's attention away from the main objective. It was a bold move, but one that had to work. If even a single ship failed to draw the Zajac's fire, the entire mission would be compromised. As they approached the flagship, a flash of red lights signaled the activation of the bomb sequence. The first wave of human ships launched their payloads, hitting the Zajac vessels with calculated precision. Explosions rang out across the battlefield, disorienting the enemy and creating chaos within their ranks. For a brief moment, the Zajac fleet seemed to falter, unsure of where to focus their fire. That's when Hawk gave the order. "Nichta." The Liberty's Hope rocketed forward, cutting through the Zajac defenses like a blade. The cloaking devices had concealed them just long enough for the final push. As they neared the flagship, the crew was already executing their final maneuver, a daring boarding operation. Human soldiers, equipped with specialized suits and tech, boarded the massive Zajac ship using small pods, each one launching into the ship's hangar bays. They fought through the corridors, securing key points as they moved toward the command center. Inside the heart of the Zek flagship, chaos erupted. The humans had infiltrated their command center, and now it was a race against time. The Zek commanders were scrambling to regain control, but they were unprepared for the human assault. The humans moved with a terrifying efficiency, planting explosive charges in strategic locations. Meanwhile, the battle outside raged on. The Zajac were realizing too late that their entire fleet was crumbling. The bombs had disabled their communication network, cutting them off from their command structure. The Zajac ships, once so coordinated and efficient, were now stumbling in disarray. The human forces capitalized on this confusion, tearing through the enemy lines with renewed vigor. Inside the flagship, Captain Hawk's team had reached the heart of the command center. The last bomb was set, and they had only moments before the Zajac force would regroup. They fought through the halls, a relentless tide of human determination against the enemy's superior strength. The final charge was planted. "We're done here, Captain," one of the soldiers radioed in, urgency in his voice. "The flagship is going down." The countdown began, and the crew raced to evacuate the flagship before the explosion ripped it apart. The blast that followed was deafening, a wave of energy that tore through the Zajac ship from the inside out, setting off a chain reaction that sent shockwaves through their entire fleet. The flagship was no more, and the Zajac forces, disoriented, divided, and leaderless, began to break apart. The humans had done it. Against all odds, they had defeated the Zajac, crippled their fleet, and forced their withdrawal from the galaxy. As the dust settled and the last of the Zajac ships retreated into the blackness of space, a heavy silence fell over the battlefield. Captain Hawk stood at the helm of the Liberty's Hope, her gaze fixed on the wreckage of the Zajac flagship as it drifted into nothingness. She had always known that humanity had something to offer the galaxy, a strength that went beyond the weapons they carried. Today, they had proven it. They had fought not just for survival, but for the future of all the races that depended on their victory. The galaxy would never forget the day the humans became the heroes it had always needed.